this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about poetry and plot. So as you looked at a poem in the genre part of this unit, you read Disabled by Wilfred Owen, and you may have noticed that there was a narrative, but does it have a plot? Well, poems definitely can have plots. There are certainly lengthier poems that have fully formed plots with all those plot parts that we've talked about, the exposition, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, and conclusion. But some poems, many poems perhaps, don't have fully formed plots with all those pieces. Nonetheless, they can still have a narrative. So when you're thinking about poetry, you definitely want to look and see, can you identify a full plot? But when you're talking about a poem that doesn't have a fully formed plot, you often can still talk about the narrative. If you think back to Disabled, you immediately know from the beginning of the poem that it's about a character who's in a wheelchair. And so you start to wonder what happened to this character. And as you read through, it becomes clear that this character was a soldier who was injured in war. So there is a narrative that emerges, and it's clear that he is feeling upset about his injuries, that he isn't able to do the things that he used to be able to do. He used to be an athlete, he used to be able to, get all the girls, and he can't do that anymore. And we get some clues, like when it says around line 30, Germans he scarcely thought of, all of their guilt, and Austria's did not move him. That gives us a sense of, who the enemy was, and that plus the poem confirms for us that this is about World War I. So there is a clear story element there. There is a narrative, but it's not a fully formed plot in the way that we've talked about plot with some of the other texts that we've read and that we're going to read. So when you're dealing with poems that don't have a fully formed plot, look for the narrative, and in addition, you can identify turns in the narrative. So those are places where the meaning shifts or changes. And those are important to identify because they, again, help to structure the meaning of the poem and structure the narrative in the poem. Again, if we look at Disabled, there's a turn pretty much at the beginning of each stanza. Each stanza shifts that meaning a little bit. Now, it's not always going to line up so neatly with the stanzas of a poem, but in this particular case, it does. So, for example, if you look at stanza 2, about this time, the town used to swing, right? So it's going from showing just the basic information about the disabled veteran and shifting to his memory of what it used to be like before the war. There's another, you can look again when one time he liked blood smeared down his leg after the matches, carried shoulder high. So there he's remembering when he was a victorious athlete rather than a soldier. So again, when he was younger, and that memory, there's a turn, and that is another unit of meaning that is that memory before it goes back to the idea of what's going on. So it's at the very end of the poem, the last stanza where it says now, that's really where it returns to the main action that was started in stanza 1. So those intervening stanzas are all these different memories that he's having, and they kind of go through his youth into when he was in the war. We get some crowds cheered him home, that's him coming home, and then finally it ends with now he will spend a few years, right? And that's returning to the original time frame that was introduced in stanza 1. So in each of those stanzas, it's kind of moving forward the chronology, first through memories, and then coming back to the present. So actually, even though we don't have a full narrative in this particular poem, we can identify flashbacks that are these memories that he's having in several of the stanzas. So even if you don't have a fully formed plot in a poem, you often can identify other types of structures, and you certainly can describe the narrative and identify places where you see turns